Hello, dear friends, I'm Philipp. A warm welcome from sunny Croatia. And the reason I'm here, well, you can see it behind me. The new Yamaha. This was our first chance to ride this machine that's already sold out, by the way, on public roads. And I'm really going to go into detail about what my first impression was like riding it on the road. We've already done a test with Martin Bauer on the racetrack. Martin also did a comparison between the new R9 and the new Panigale V2 on the racetrack. But this was the very first opportunity we've had here in Germany to take it out on the road. And that's what we've now done. So now I want to explain in detail what can this bike actually do. But for that, we'll head back to the studio where it's a bit quieter and we've got a bit more time. Stick around. Yes, dear 1000 PS friends, as I said, I'm now back again from the studio. Why? Because the time in Rijeka with the new model was actually pretty limited and there really wasn't enough time left to record a proper longer video. So I thought, all right, I'll do the intro over there, and now I want to take my time with all my notes to give you a full impression of the R9 out on the road. Just briefly, what we're going to do with this video, I'm not going to go too deep into the technical details. Why not? Because there's already that video with Martin Bauer from the launch, and there's another one where he compared it with the Panigale V2 here in our studio. So you've already got a lot of insights into the bike, especially how it performs on track. But I do want to add this, I also did 2 sessions myself with it on the racetrack in Rijeka. Then the bike was completely converted overnight, cleaned up and prepped for the road so we could ride it the next day on public roads. That was our first chance to ride the R9 on the street. And that's exactly what this video is about, those first impressions from the road. Martin Bauer, our fastest man, already explained everything about how it behaves on the racetrack. My job now is to give you a bit of insight into how it rides on the road. So let's dive right in. The first thing I want to talk about is, of course, the engine. Basically, what you need to know is that the engine hasn't changed. It's more or less very familiar. We know it from the MT-09 and from the Tracer 9. This engine is tried and tested, and it's no coincidence that we've repeatedly given it the title of an almost perfect road engine, and that's not without reason. Why? Because we've got a 3-cylinder here, and in this case it really does combine the best of both worlds, rev happiness and torque. It's an engine that, well, I'm not necessarily the biggest 3-cylinder fan by default, but I have to say the triple in the Yamaha, or now in the R9, is a fantastic all-rounder for road use. It's got a smoothness to it, more so than most twins, but at the same time it doesn't quite have the rev range of a 4-cylinder. That means it's got more punch at the bottom end, and you really notice that when you're out riding the new model on the road. The R9 has torque low down, it's got torque in the mid-range, and if you want you can rev it out at the top and access the full 110 horsepower. And on this new bike, that is more than enough for the road, absolutely in every situation. The engine is spot on. I also took it out on the track, as I mentioned earlier. And I have to say, even though I'm probably around 20 to 25 seconds slower per lap than someone like Martin Bauer, those 110 horsepower the R9 delivers are totally sufficient for me on the racetrack as well, because you can really stay on the throttle. With bikes that have, let's say, over 150 horsepower, you just can't be wide open on the throttle as often. I mean, sure, if you've got the skills, you can. But for us average riders, it gets harder and harder to properly wind it out, because the straights just aren't long enough anymore. It's the same with the R9. It's got just the right amount of punch so that you can have a blast both on the road and on the racetrack with my level of riding ability without ever feeling overwhelmed by the engine or like it's too much. No, in my opinion, Yamaha has really hit a sweet spot here. You don't need more than this. Thanks to the increased displacement, just under 900 cubic centimeters, you also get plenty of torque from low down, which means that both on the road and on track, even if you accidentally shift into the wrong gear or come into a corner a bit too high in the revs, it still pulls cleanly. You've always got enough torque to pull the engine and the bike out of the corner, and that makes things a lot less stressful because you don't have to ride ultra precisely like you would with a smaller, high-revving four-cylinder that only delivers power in a narrow band. Here you've got torque down low, power at the top, and on top of that a really brilliant gearbox. Whether you're shifting manually or using the quick shifter, both up and down, it all just works flawlessly. I really have to say, engine rating for road use on the R9, clearly 5 out of 5. No question. The next point I want to talk about, and for me it's the bike's biggest unique selling point, especially for riding on the road, is the ergonomics. Why? I already said this back when I rode the R7. That one, basically the little sister of the R9 based on the CP2 platform, has now sold out and isn't currently available. It had a fairly, I wouldn't even say fairly, it had a very sporty riding position. Why? Because the handlebars, or more precisely the clip-ons, were mounted underneath the top yoke. That means you had a very low bar position at the front. You also had a relatively high seat, which means that although the tank is fairly short, even on the R7, it doesn't stretch you out too far, but it does put you in a fairly low tucked position. And I always used to say, riding that bike on the road, it felt very physical. Why? Because it demands a lot from you physically. There isn't too much weight on your wrists, since the tank isn't overly long. But because the clip-ons are mounted below the top yoke, you end up with a lot of weight on the front end. You're almost forced to control the bike mainly through your legs and your core strength. So yes, you can grip the tank tightly with your knees, left and right, which I'd strongly recommend to relieve some pressure from your wrists. But what really started to cause some pain for me after about 120 kilometers on the road was my neck. I'm around 6.1 feet tall with normal proportions, and when I sit on this bike with those low mounted clip-ons, I really have to tilt my head back quite a bit and over a longer period of time. Those 120 kilometers we did, I'd say that took about 2 to 2.5 hours, including a few photo stops here and there. I really started to feel it then, and even 2 days later I still had some mild neck pain. I was using a relatively lightweight helmet during the test, but even so I have to say that this riding position for me on the road, and I emphasize for the road, was simply too demanding. Personally, I think if you're riding only on public roads, unless you're really into that ultra sporty look, which is impressive, but if your focus is purely on road riding and you want this engine, you might be better off going for the MT9, because in my view you sit much more comfortably on that. The new generation is also a bit more front-end oriented, but nowhere near as extreme as the R9. And when it comes to ergonomics and the physical effort it takes to ride at a brisk pace, I think the MT9 makes for the better road bike. The R9 really demands more from me physically, especially when you ride like we did at the start along those Croatian coastal roads with longer sweeping bends, great tarmac, pretty smooth overall, ideal for flowing riding. That's where the R9 feels right at home. You can ride it either in a torque-focused style or really push it a bit more performance-wise. If you're riding well, both approaches work. And when you're carving through those flowing curves on the R9, the chassis performs brilliantly, but I'll come back to that later. And yes, at those higher speeds, you also get enough wind pressure from the front. That starts at around 80 kilometers per hour and up. Then the riding position becomes a bit less tiring. You can kind of rest your upper body a bit on a cushion of wind, which helps me out a little. The wind pressure from the front takes some of the weight off my wrists. After that, we turned off onto a beautiful smaller mountain road with tight hairpins going both up and down. And that's where things start to get tough. Because when you're going downhill on the R9, there are two main issues. First, the speeds drop. Like I said, hairpins very tight, very technical, so you no longer have that wind pressure to lean into, which means you have to support much more of your upper body weight yourself. And then, because you're going slower and you're heading downhill, you naturally end up braking more since you just pick up speed constantly on the descent. So you're braking downhill and you end up having to tilt your head even more backwards. You sort of end up in what I'd call a physical downward spiral where it genuinely becomes exhausting. Sitting up on an MT or a road bike, you'd be much more relaxed, almost like you're gliding cafe style through the bends. On the R9, the work starts. And that's something you definitely need to know if you're considering buying the R9 for road use. I'm saying this quite deliberately for the road because that type of riding is just different. On the track, on the other hand, I did 2 sessions with it. The riding position was spot on. Not overwhelming, just right in my opinion. You're only doing 20 to 30 minute stints, and for that, it's perfect. You sweat a bit afterwards, but it's manageable and you get a great feel for the front end. It all fits. But if I were to do several hours a day, say 300 to 400 kilometer day trips, including stretches of motorway, honestly, I think I'd really be sweating on the R9 and would probably enjoy it less, me personally, but I think many other riders would too, compared to something like the MT9, because the riding position really is physically demanding. Let's move on to the suspension. And I have to say, the suspension really surprised me. We've got a setup in here. You already know the details by now. Fully adjustable. Brilliant. I also took it out on the racetrack and I was genuinely surprised, positively surprised in fact, at how good this suspension is. We were riding on slicks in Rijeka and the bike had been properly set up for the track. Rijeka is quite a fast and flowing circuit. It was my first time there and the suspension gave me loads of confidence. I had a very clear sense of what the bike was doing underneath me, especially in combination with the sporty riding position. On the road, I have to say the suspension also impressed me. I would have set it just a touch softer though, because on the absolutely smooth Croatian coastal roads it worked flawlessly in its standard setting. You did get the occasional sharp hit through the seat on really short, harsh bumps, but overall it performed well. Then when things got a bit more varied, second-class roads, tight mountain hairpins, I felt the suspension was maybe a little too firm, not dangerously so or anything like that. It didn't start skipping or losing grip, but I reckon it could have absorbed a bit more. I'm sure that's within the range of adjustment. We didn't have the time to try different settings, but I definitely trust the engineers on that front. That's definitely something you can adjust, softening it a bit more for those everyday roads we all ride on, and then it works just fine. One small point about the suspension and handling that all of us noticed while riding, especially on the road, when you're out on the bike and you approach a corner, say it tightens unexpectedly or you're a bit late on the brakes, meaning you brake fairly hard into the bend, at some point there's a moment where it's best to start easing off the brakes because the bike doesn't stay particularly agile if you keep them on. The bike has a very high base level of stability, but if I brake deep into the corner or if I have to make a correction mid-turn, it's best to release the brake, because while on the brakes the bike doesn't really want to change direction. We especially notice this going uphill in the mountains. If you know about it, it's no big deal, you just factor it in. But I want to point this out because if you're coming from a naked bike, for example from an MT-07 or even an MT9, this won't be an issue at all. On those, you can always make mid-corner corrections even while braking, because you've got the wide handlebars and the upright seating position, and with small inputs you can still steer the bike easily. That's definitely something you can adjust, softening it a bit more for those everyday roads we all ride on, and then it works just fine. One small point about the suspension and handling that all of us noticed while riding, especially on the road, when you're out on the bike and you approach a corner, say it tightens unexpectedly or you're a bit late on the brakes, meaning you brake fairly hard into the bend, at some point there's a moment where it's best to start easing off the brakes because the bike doesn't stay particularly agile if you keep them on. The bike has a very high base level of stability, but if I brake deep into the corner or if I have to make a correction mid-turn, it's best to release the brake, because while on the brakes the bike doesn't really want to change direction. We especially notice this going uphill in the mountains. If you know about it, it's no big deal, you just factor it in. But I want to point this out because if you're coming from a naked bike, for example from an MT-07 or even an MT9, this won't be an issue at all. On those, you can always make mid-corner corrections even while braking, because you've got the wide handlebars and the upright seating position, and with small inputs you can still steer the bike easily. That's no longer the case with the R9. You really need to know in advance, ideally, what line you want to take, especially when braking downhill. Then it works. But if you brake into a lean or worse, while already in a deep lean angle, and you need to make a correction while still on the brakes, the bike tends to want to go straight. So that's something road riders might want to be aware of. What I really liked about the R9 on the road, I have to say, was the wind protection. I've already mentioned it. When riding at a normal pace, you get a nice cushion of air around you that you can lean into, which helps take the pressure off your wrists. And that makes things relatively comfortable even at higher speeds, on the motorway, for example. Or when you want to tuck in behind the screen, there's room to do so. The windscreen behind me provides some decent shelter, which helps conserve energy on track, but also on the road. If you're in a bit of a rush or want to cover lots of kilometers without sitting fully exposed to the wind. When the tire is still, let's say, cool, or you're not riding very fast, it feels not exactly wooden, but maybe a bit stiff or reluctant. You can tell the bike needs a bit of temperature and some load through the suspension to get the tire working properly. But once everything is up to operating temperature, it all comes together really nicely. In general, the steering response of the new bike on the road, as I already mentioned, the initial turn-in is excellent, but you do need to ride with some body input. The bike tends to want to be ridden either with some lean or in a more actively engaged way. It's not like you just hop on and give it a quick flick and it glides effortlessly into the bend on its own. But once you really start riding actively, leaning out a bit into the corners with your upper body, shifting your weight slightly on the seat, maybe pressing your thigh against the tank and keeping the balls of your feet firmly on the pegs, then the bike gives you brilliant feedback. It all becomes very fluid and connected and you can really let it rip. I was honestly very surprised, even on the racetrack, by the lean angle clearance on this bike. When the tire is still, let's say, cool, or you're not riding very fast, it feels not exactly wooden, but maybe a bit stiff or reluctant. You can tell the bike needs a bit of temperature and some load through the suspension to get the tire working properly. But once everything is up to operating temperature, it all comes together really nicely. In general, the steering response of the new bike on the road, as I already mentioned, the initial turn-in is excellent, but you do need to ride with some body input. The bike tends to want to be ridden either with some lean or in a more actively engaged way. It's not like you just hop on and give it a quick flick and it glides effortlessly into the bend on its own. But once you really start riding actively, leaning out a bit into the corners with your upper body, shifting your weight slightly on the seat, maybe pressing your thigh against the tank and keeping the balls of your feet firmly on the pegs, then the bike gives you brilliant feedback. It all becomes very fluid and connected and you can really let it rip. I was honestly very surprised, even on the racetrack, by the lean angle clearance on this bike. We were running slicks, so we were right up at the limit of what's possible and nothing scraped. You can push this bike really hard before anything starts touching down, so you're moving at a very decent pace. It all works flawlessly. The brakes too, absolutely spot on. Both on track and on the road, I genuinely have nothing negative to say. On the contrary, nice firm bite point, great feel for the front end. Even when you're still on the brakes, the modulation is excellent. As for the ABS, I have to admit we had it switched off on the racetrack. On the road, I think I triggered it maybe once or twice just to test it, but it never really kicked in because we were riding in a fairly smooth and flowing style. The rear brake is also easy to control. I really enjoyed the electronics package. I have to admit, on the track, my brain wasn't entirely in sync and I kept watching the dash to see how often the traction control would flash. But on the road, and that's what really matters here, I had a bit more capacity to check how often the traction control actually engaged. And I have to say that was absolutely spot on. I really liked it. There were 2 or 3 hairpins where the surface was a bit smoother, so it was all about having a delicate touch coming out of the corner. I tried to provoke it a little, just at the apex, giving it a bit more throttle to see when and how the traction control would kick in. And honestly, I have to say, in those moments, I experienced 2 or 3 incredibly subtle traction control interventions coming out of those bends. You could really feel it. It was like, okay, I'm giving it a bit more throttle now, and here comes the electronics. And the way it kicked in, it didn't cut power abruptly or mess with the line. It was a very smooth transition, and you realize, okay, now I'm in that zone where the traction control is gently helping out. Then I ease off the throttle and I'm back in full control. That was flawless and gave me an extremely secure feeling. So I'd say, for those of you riding on the road, you've got a great electronics package on board that you can absolutely rely on, even in trickier situations. All in all, the Yamaha R9 on the road, in my opinion, is a very capable road bike if you're willing to ride something that demands a bit more physically. If you're not in top shape, or you just want something more relaxed in terms of movement and ergonomics, then there are other options like the MT or the Tracer or some other models that might suit you better than the R9, just based on what the bike inherently is. But if you're saying, no, this is exactly what I want, and especially if you're only using the bike 50% of the time on the road, or even just 40%, and the rest on the track, then you've got a fantastic platform here, because it really can handle both. It's just physically demanding, that's all. But straight out of the box for us hobby riders, it's a really, really solid package for the racetrack. You don't need to do much. Or maybe swap out the tires if you want, and then you're good to go for track use, and that demanding riding position doesn't bother you there because you're riding in shorter stints with longer breaks in between. There's plenty of lean angle clearance, the electronics work flawlessly, and the engine is an absolute beast. So I really have to say, for proper hobby level riders, it's a great balance between road and track use. And that's why I recommend it to those of you out there who are interested in this bike. Make sure you take it for a test ride to see whether the ergonomics work for you, whether it might be just a bit too much for regular road riding. If it's not too much for you and you're thinking of using it on the track as well, or you're a seriously sporty road rider who values that maximum front-end feel and is willing to accept that the riding position demands a lot, then the R9 is definitely a bike worth considering. As I said, engine flawless, electronics flawless, suspension very good. Personally, I wouldn't hesitate to take it to several track days. No need to invest in anything extra. It all works brilliantly. It didn't overheat for us either, not at my riding level at least. And the brakes, spot on as well. All in all, I must say, it's a very, very nice overall package, especially when you consider that it's a physical motorcycle. And for anyone who thinks they'd like a bit more of that, but in a more relaxed ride, I can definitely say no. An ABS system is absolutely a viable alternative, which in many respects is very, very comparable. I mean, it's essentially the same concept, only not tuned so aggressively for sport. So I can only ask you this. If this video has helped you at all, please do leave a comment. And if you have any questions, write them down in the comments. I'm here to answer them. I welcome any kind of feedback, be it criticism or praise. It happens now and then. Give us a like, subscribe to our channel. With that, thanks very much for watching.